Hey, what's up, Canada and beyond? Welcome back on a beautiful Wednesday early afternoon for another round of Doctor Talks. For those of you guys that are new to this little series that we've been running, we've been very blessed to have some of the most credentialed experts in North America and in some cases the world joining us for the last couple of weeks now and sharing with you the truth and the science and the evidence as they see it in an effort to clear the noise out there in this giant pandemic that, or whatever it is that people call it. Everybody's got a different name for it, but it's absolutely a chaotic time in Canadian history, and a lot of people are searching desperately for answers. So this has kind of come about through over the last couple of weeks. I had an initial discussion with Dr. Bridle, who was one of the team members who had challenged Doug Ford and the medical officials of the provincial government of Ontario to an open dialogue debate, not an unreasonable question. And what has happened subsequently since then has led us to having discussions like this and an opportunity for the people of Canada and the world to take part directly listening to the people that we should be listening to. So on that note, while we're live here, folks, please give this a share this out everywhere. You don't get penalized if you share while we're live streaming. And without further ado, I will bring in our next guest, who I think is going to be the icing on the cake for this debate team. Welcome to the show, Dr. Mallard.
Hi, Wayne. Thanks for having me.
It's been such a refreshing opportunity to speak with all of you guys. There's no way that I can express the gratitude, and on behalf of our followers as well. After 14, 15 months of all of this chaos and noise, to have reasonable voices of expertise. Trust has been broken in so many levels, and you guys are going a long ways to reaffirming the trust that people are desperately searching for. So I really wanted to thank you on behalf of the audience for taking the time to join us. So for the people that aren't familiar with you out there, give us a little bit of your background and how it is that you are in a position to be amongst this team of experts and what you're bringing to the world as far as for truth and knowledge.
Yeah, so Wayne, I've been professor of immunogenetics at the University of Guelph for the past 30 years. So that means I work, at the interface of immunology and genetics. So genetic regulation of the immune system, and that's all pertinent when it comes to this pandemic. So I'm really happy to be here and maybe shed some light on the immunological aspects of COVID-19.
Well, that's really quite a mouthful for us kitchen table talk kind of folks here, and I'm glad you put it that way. Kind of the intersection of this. So this is what we're seeing with this program that's coming out here. This is not a traditional vaccine, and this is something that people don't really understand. A lot of this behind this, and we have an educated population in Canada, probably more so than many other nations in the world, and they are demanding answers, and they're not getting them from the the legacy medical system and the establishment. So can you elaborate a little bit on that and what brought you to the table with this expertise for exactly this kind of debate and discussion?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you, I'll tell you a little bit more about my background too, because I think that's going to add kind of credibility, and it will help you understand, or the audience understand, where I'm coming from. So, I think I've been really fortunate over the years to have won a number of awards. And I think I want to tell you about that because, again, it's going to add some credibility. So I won the Governor General's Award in 2017 for innovation in the area of immunogenetics. And even this year, I have won it's a very prestigious NSERC Prize. I can't tell you exactly what it is because NSERC is going to announce it formally, but NSERC's the National Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada. I will be the only Canadian to have ever won both of those awards.
Wow.
So again, because people are, and I say that because people are looking for credible voices. They don't really know who to believe. And the other thing I think that's pertinent to this is the fact that I've worked in many species over the course of my career. I've worked in cattle, in pigs, in chickens, in rabbits, horses, sheep, a number of species. And some people have said, well, why are you talking about this human virus? Well, one of the reasons is that these pandemics and epidemics now almost always arise from an animal species. Mm-hmm. We know about swine flu. We've all heard about that. We know about many of the viruses coming from bats and pangolin. So if you've worked across a wide range of species, I think it gives you a perspective and an understanding. The other thing I think I'd like to say before I go too much further is I want to make it clear I am not an anti-vaxxer. I think it's well known that vaccines have been a huge help in controlling things like polio, smallpox, rabies, diphtheria, and I could go on. Right.
And this is sorry to interrupt there. This brings up a very, very important point, and one of the most significant things about this series of interviews that I've been able to do is that I think our government at every level has done a huge disservice, and particularly the media, in labeling people negatively for asking questions. And so what we're seeing is a large population that is educated enough to ask questions, and the instant they do, they're berated or labeled in a negative fashion, and that perpetrates a series of abuse that is really not justified. And this is where this series is so valuable and important, is that most of us accept exactly those same things. Mm-hmm. And we just want a discussion. We're not necessarily anti-vaxxers or anti-medicine or anti these kinds of things, but to be labeled as such and persecuted as such is where really is turning the tide the other way against the discussion. And I think you guys are experiencing very much the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, for sure we are. And I mean, I think one of the other reasons I'm happy to come and chat with you is because of the letter that we wrote to Premier Doug Ford. And, our group got the idea because we knew that the same had been done by like-minded people in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so really we wanted to follow suit. And so we selected a group of experts, some in virology, some in immunology, epidemiology.
The diversity of this panel has been overwhelmingly impressive.
Exactly. And medicine and even psychology. And so all we wanted to do was to have what you said was an open discussion. And we wanted it to be in front of the Canadian public so that they could hear this conversation. And we also wanted it because, scientists are used to having conversations, and that's how we push our understanding forward. That's how we get and build consensus. And we really needed some new ideas. And so we were disappointed, very disappointed. None of the three provinces responded.
None of them have.
No, none of them have. And so, this went out to, the letter went widely. It kind of went to 50 media outlets, and a few picked it up, like you. And, you were really kind to say, would you like to talk about it? And we did. We do want to talk about it because we wanted to talk about it with the Canadian people, and we still do. So here we are, and hopefully people are really enjoying the series and getting information that's valuable to their decision making, because right now Canadians are in the middle of making very, very important decisions for their families.
And this is exactly what's causing or creating the hunger for the information. And I mean, I've been doing this for quite some time, and I've learned to watch and to gauge how things are moving after they've been discussed. And quite often, most of the topics and subjects that we cover they have a shelf life of about 30 seconds because there's another wave of something else coming at us that, you know, but this series and the information that you guys are delivering from such a broad spectrum of perspectives and expertise has really been, you know, almost a scientific process for myself as well, in taking and looking at all of the evidence that you guys are providing and seeing some of the discrepancies and some of the failings in all of this. And this is really starting to shine a light on where some of the problems are happening. So again, this is so important that you guys are doing this and bringing this to the public, that it's been probably the best source of information for the Canadian public that I've seen out there in a very long time. And it's really helped me as well to eliminate all of that noise that's out there. That's the significance of doing this. And day by day, Canadians are becoming more and more engaged in this series, in following what you guys are doing, and they're asking incredibly relevant questions on this. So in bringing this debate to the table, what were some of the things that you specifically had wanted to address to the public within this debate? I know we could talk for days about the different things, and we've had the opportunity now to have a couple of extended conversations, and there's a lot of topics that need to be covered. But I wanted to focus on this debate challenge first, because you guys are working through a specific process and with a strategy and a system in mind, and then after this there will be opportunity to address many other things. So in the light of this debate to the Ford government, what is it that you wanted to specifically address within that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, one would be just where can people get information? Where do I get my information? What makes me, able to speak about this? And so, I mean, there are a number of places people can go to get information, including myself, right? So you can go to the peer-reviewed literature, and this is really important, and we do this all the time. The public has some access to that, but not as widely as I would have. But I want to say something about that, because while that's a really important portal to go to, with COVID, with everything happening so quickly, a lot of material was published and then had to be retracted. And I always tell my students, just because something's in Nature doesn't mean it's the gospel. Again, you have to look at it, you have to look at the methods, you have to critique it. And so we don't just read the literature, but we really try to examine it from all angles. So that's number one. But then you've got to have discussions. You've got to have discussions with colleagues, with other experts, and then have discussions, not just with the scientists, but with the physicians, with the people on the ground. And I mean, that's part of, I think, the beauty of this group, the Canadian COVID Care Alliance that I'm part of, because we're on calls, sometimes 5 nights a week, discussing, here was a paper. What did that mean? Does it line up with what you're seeing on the ground? And so there's this broad background that we're drawing from. Government reports are important. What is the CDC saying? What is WHO saying? And again, we've got to examine that critically. So I think I want to say that because that's where we're coming from. And that's where I think the Canadian public has to come from. You can't just rely on the mainstream news.
And this is one of the things that from my perspective, sitting on the other side of this and not living my life in the world that you guys do, this is one of the things that is really started to get my attention in this is the peer-reviewed paper process. And you alluded to the fact that several had been retracted and things like that. So to me, this is in the light of the consequences and the expenses of mistakes in a situation like this at a national level, that is something that I feel personally is something that we need to be looking closer at, is how does this process, and again, I'm not a physician, so I don't necessarily have the understanding of how this process works, but I can see that there's a problem within it, and it's an expensive one if it's not going to be addressed.
It can be, but the idea is once it's in the literature, you still have lots of time to talk about it. That's what we do. You get together, you examine it, right? And you build a consensus as you go along. And so that's what we've been doing. And I guess one of the things then what I want to address today is the immunological aspects, because that's where I am an expert. And so I think can we get right into that?
Absolutely. This is your chance. You got an hour here. Let her buck.
Okay. Okay. Let her buck. That's funny because I have horses, so I try not to let them buck. But we'll try to have a little bit of a smooth ride. How about through?
Sounds good.
Yeah, through this. So immunity. I mean, that's what we're after here. Actually, is immunity. People think we're after getting everyone vaccinated, but we're after immunity. That's our goal. And there's two ways to get that. And the one is natural exposure and the other is vaccination. So let's just talk about the natural exposure first, because we know a lot about this now. So first, let's say it's going to happen. Natural exposure is bound to happen sooner or later, because this virus is now endemic. There's no longer a question about that. I do still run into people who say, well, if we just lock down long enough, strong enough, the virus is going to go away. No, it's definitely too late for that. And it would mean no one could ever come into Canada or go out of Canada or cross a boundary, because the virus is in the world and we're not going to get rid of it. So we're going to have to learn to live with it. Now, here's what we know is people that have been exposed to the virus and have recovered, they do have immunity. And I don't think that message has gotten out. And so
you're very correct on that, and on that note specifically, not to take anything away from what we're talking about here. There was an interview with Dr. Peter McCullough that Tucker Carlson did, where that was, to me, that hit me like a ton of bricks. And on that note, I've chased him down, and he's going to be coming on for a doctor talk this afternoon with us.
Oh, is he? Okay,
yes,
I will enjoy talking to Peter. He's great, and we talk to him often. And I mean, his area of expertise is definitely on treatment. So you're going.
I'm glad you're on this point, because this is now going to give us different perspectives from different experts on and addressing the same point. And this is exactly what Canadians need to hear right now.
I think so. So if you've been exposed, you have immunity. But let's dig deeper into that, because there's some information Canadians need. If you just had a positive COVID test, that doesn't actually for sure mean that you had COVID, because there are a lot of false positives there, especially when you're running PCRs at very high rates. That's a little bit of a topic for another day. But what I want to say is that if you did test positive and then you also had the signs and symptoms, now you can be pretty sure that you had COVID, because you've got two. We don't usually just use a PCR as the sole diagnostic test. Even, WHO, CDC does not recommend that. Our National Microbiology Lab, it doesn't recommend that. So if you tested positive, you did have the signs and symptoms, and you did recover, you can be pretty comfortable that you have got broad-based immunity. And I say broad-based immunity because you've seen the actual whole virus, not just a part of it. So you've seen the spike, and you've seen the envelope, and you've seen the nucleocapsid, and you've made an immunological response to all of those elements, which gives you a very strong immunity. And we know that. So for example, people that recovered from the first SARS-1, which is kind of 17 years ago now, they had immunity, we could see, to this SARS virus 17 years later. So some of this immunity can last very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And in the studies that have been done so far and published, it's very clear that people who have recovered, one, they don't get infected twice for the most part, very, very rarely. You can go around trying to find people infected twice, and you can probably count them on like two hands. Like, it's rare. Everyone agrees with that. So, if the studies now that have been done clearly show 8 to 12 months of immunity, and that's the length of time of the study, right? We haven't been in this long enough, but that's very encouraging. And I think we'll put a link below so people can see some of the really very credible work by Seta and Grotti out of California. These are very good immunologists. So that's kind of, I think, can build confidence in people that have recovered. They, and then if they're thinking about their decisions in terms of, do I need a vaccine, or if vaccines are in short supply, this may play into their decision making. And I don't think they've really had that clearly known to them. You are immune. You can go out. We should have let them go out. They definitely are a group that could move around freely.
Well, this kind of leads us to exactly the cause that we end up having a discussion like this in a platform like this, is that there's a lot of information, including this kind of stuff, is not being allowed to be dispersed amongst the public. And so the counter to that is an extreme politicization of vaccination, which you guys are pro-vaccine, but in this instance, you're seeing an opposite behavior. And this is what is really alarming the people. Why are we not allowed to have a discussion? Why is the government so strongly pushing this vaccination thing? And this is not to politicize what you guys are doing, but it's unfortunate that you guys are being affected by politics. You guys are being hindered from actually practicing knowledgeable and transfer of information, informed consent, and a lot of these things that are foreign to you guys. After 30 years, you should be the people that the entire nation should be listening to, not sitting on alternative media platforms in order to get your message across. Although in this day and age, the alternative media seems to have more reach and more influence than any of the mainstream media. But this is the disparity that's creating the tension within the community, within people's own home.
Yeah. I agree. And I think people just need this kind of information. And now, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was new. And, initially we did have to hunker down until we figured stuff out. But, we have figured a lot out now. Now we don't have to rely on models. We actually have the hard data. So we know people are rarely infected twice. And so we want to go with what's happening generally, not what's happening rarely. So, generally, if you've recovered, you're immune, you've got broad-based immunity, you can feel comfortable. And that's going to play into your decision about getting vaccinated. And then, the other thing is, what about your age? Like, who is really at risk? So I have the statistics actually just sitting right in front of me. And I think this is another important statistic. So if you look, for example, how many people under 20, well, let me back up. So about 25,000 people have died in Canada from COVID. We don't want any deaths, but that's not practical, not in a pandemic. That's just not, you minimize it, but there's going to be deaths. So 25,000. But now we're going to look at that by age group. Maybe we're going to start at the 80 plus. So 25,000, and of those 25,000, 16,442 as of last week were 80 years or older. That tells you right there who the high risk group is. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum, under 20. Again, As of May 14th, it was 12 people. So these are low risk. And remember, the other thing is, you usually have to have some comorbidity, one or more. Between 20 and 29, 51 deaths. Between 30 and 39, 113 deaths. But so you can see much less risk. And so those people have to ask themselves, everyone needs to ask themselves the question, have I had COVID? Yes or no? What risk group am I in terms of my age? Do I have a comorbidity? Yes or no? These are going to help people understand and make informed decisions about should they or do they need to get the vaccine. And then we'll talk about, what these vaccines are, which one might you want to choose if you're going to choose one. But again, I just don't think we haven't been helping people make these kinds of risk benefit decisions. We've just said carte blanche, everyone should be vaccinated. And in fact, that's not necessary. And when vaccines are in short supply, and the other thing is, you should not be vaccinated if you are actively infected or you've been recently infected. For sure, we know that's basic immunology 101. Don't do it because it won't work. If you already have an active immune response, like antibodies circulating around because you've got COVID or you recently have COVID, and then you try to induce more antibody through vaccination, your body has feedback mechanisms. And essentially it's saying, why should I produce more antibody? Or why should I produce more T cells? I've got lots of those. And that's why you don't vaccinate neonates, babies that have antibodies and protective immunity from their mothers, because the vaccine won't work. And so I don't think people know that. We're just telling people, if you have COVID, if you recently had COVID, everybody get vaccinated no matter what. We're not having a clear, informed discussion about that. So things to think about.
I think you hit the nail on the head with one word: practical. And this is, I think, where this is really turning off the general population is I mean, first of all, there's something out there and it is killing people. It is, we can easily identify who is the most at risk. Yes. And we have no problems with having practical discussions about how to treat, handle, or manage these kinds of things. But there's no practical understanding for the entire nation being subjective to the measures that there's no practical way for the people to understand or justify any of this, especially when discussions about treatment or alternatives or practical handling of things is nowhere near the forefront of discussion. No. When they're being pushed into something that they don't understand, which is this.
And I think that became really important too, Wayne, because once we started to see some of the effects on children, having them out of school, keeping them heavily masked, just the isolation, we know, and we know drug abuse, we know child abuse, I'm afraid to say.
I call it COVID collateral, and it is far, far huger than I think that.
It's very large, and it has become, in many ways, I think really we're going to find it killed more than 25,000 people. I think that's the consensus that we're coming to. And as I just told you, kids weren't at risk, right? Mm-hmm. And here's the big one. We should have been testing for antibody all the way along the line to see who actually has recovered, right? Now, I think you had on your show Steve Pellet. He's a professor from UBC. He's developed Canadians are really innovators. They have great innovation, and he has a wonderful test that detects antibodies to all components of the virus, not just the spike protein. And when he looked in where he lives in Vancouver, many months ago now, he found that 90%, and he always likes to say, yes, that's 90% of people already had antibody to COVID. Oh, that means they already were exposed and they recovered.
That should be amazing news. We should be shouting that from the rooftops.
We should. And he published it, and it is in a peer-reviewed journal. And we just need to be talking about that. So, 90%, these people, that's herd immunity, right? That's good level of herd immunity. Now, why is it so high in Vancouver? That's because we think that was ground zero. So that's probably where it started. That's where we had a lot of exposure early on. Sometimes people, we know now, you might be exposed, you make an immune response, but you don't get sick. You don't even know it. That's not uncommon either. And if you test for antibody, then maybe you didn't have a COVID PCR test, and maybe you didn't have signs and symptoms, but if you go and get an antibody test, then that will also tell you. Now, when I say that, people come back to me and they say, but not everyone's going to make antibody. That's right, not everyone, but the vast majority are going to. So it's a good indicator. It's quick, it's simple, it's inexpensive. It will tell you if you have been exposed. Now, Steve's test, we would love to see it used more broadly. Also, Life Labs has a test. And you can go and you can pay $75 or whatever it is, and you can have your antibody tested. So you can do that yourself. The Life Labs test isn't as robust, or shall I say broad, as Steve's test. It is only looking at antibody to spike. But again, it's an indication that, yes, you've made antibody. So, yeah, and now this can go into your informed decision-making package. So, I recommend that. Now, the other thing is, really, we should be testing after vaccination as well to see if you made antibody, just to see. Now, we don't usually do this. So when you get your flu vaccine, you don't come back 2 or 3 weeks later and see if you made antibody. We don't bother. But in this case, I think we should bother. And the reason I think we should is because these vaccines are new, they're controversial. Not everyone might want to get vaccinated. And that would tell you at least, if you did get vaccinated, did it work? Am I actually protected? And sometimes we're seeing the people that are going and having that done, they're seeing no, they don't have antibodies. So at least then we can discuss that. Why is that? If there's, does it mean the vaccine didn't work? Are you just one of the rare people that didn't produce antibody? But these vaccines are designed to induce antibody production. But information is power. And so as an immunologist, I am a big proponent of testing for antibody, either, to see if you've been exposed and recovered previously, if you are in doubt, right? So if you were asymptomatic, you might want to just test to see before you go and get vaccinated. Again, I'd love to see Steve's test used. If not, and you get the vaccine, then you probably want to know if it worked. In this case, maybe we won't just make the assumption that it works, because a lot's at stake. A lot's riding on this. And then there is the T cell test. There is the T cell test as well. And it's called T-Detect, and it's being used in some countries in the US, and that gives you an indication of the T cell side of things. But antibodies quick, and it's a nice way to have a quick look.
In my kitchen table fashion, what I'm hearing out of this, and because I have to keep it simple for my little brain, is that this again leads me to more questions. Why this is what we should be doing? This would be the common sense approach, is to be testing for this, because it's going to be far more efficient, far more practical than to be moving an entire population directly to an unknown potential cure, potential something. There's not enough data to really for us to feel, or myself to feel comfortable in all of this, and so having access to common sense approach, as in,
Yeah.
is testing, would make a whole lot more sense to me and the general public than trying to reach for this COVID zero through vaccine attempt. Is just so not practical with something so new, so frightening. As and again, most people are educated, and right, wrong, or otherwise, they've been forced to reach out to information sources that aren't that necessarily credible or whatnot. And I think not that they're anti-vaxxers, but they are absolutely or hesitant of this because they're not getting any answers. And we're seeing a lot of reports of negative effects and a lack of discussion on that. There's nobody to pacify or explain all of that. And again, people are shut down for asking a question on it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's still a lot to learn about these vaccines, and maybe I'll just spend a couple of minutes and we'll just talk about the vaccines, what they are, what we know about them so far, because there's a lot of misinformation, like you say. So, I mean, the first thing I always like to make sure Canadians understand, and I think for the most part they do, is that these vaccines are not fully licensed. They're operating under what's called EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. And that was allowed because of the pandemic, but it does mean they have not completed their phase 3 clinical trials, as would be normally the case. And those clinical trials will not be completed till about 2023. And that's why normally vaccines take a long time to come to market. I mean, they take 5 to 10 years. Whatever way you cut the ice, that is the normal.
That's acceptable, for the population to understand and digest. They've done some homework. What we're seeing now is not.
Yeah. So just so people, I think then once the public's aware of that, I think that's an awareness so that they can make appropriate decisions. And then let's talk about the nature of the vaccines, because there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. So the Pfizer and Moderna, well, all of the vaccines that we're currently using are either RNA or DNA. Those are nucleic acids. We have not used these before, ever, in human vaccination. But people, then they come back and they say, oh, but you've been studying these for many years. You know something about them. We know something, but we don't know the whole story. And here's the thing I wanted to say here. I've worked in research for many years, and I have brought several inventions all the way through the pipeline out to commercialization. But I'm going to tell you, because something works on the bench, because something works in my small trials, does not guarantee that these scale. It does not guarantee that it's safe for commercial use. That doesn't happen until you test thousands and thousands of these at big scale. And if you're fortunate, they work. So by saying, yeah, we've been studying these for a period of time, that's correct. But we have never scaled this before. And for me, I really want to see the completion of the phase 3 clinical trials. But we are vaccinating people, and we are learning a lot from the people that are vaccinated. But let's just talk a little bit more in depth. So Pfizer and Moderna, what happens there is you get the recipe, I like to say. You get the RNA, the messenger RNA. That's the recipe to make the spike protein of the virus. And it's delivered in what's called a lipid nanoparticle. And people have likened these to fat bubbles. So, you've got like your fat bubble, and inside is the recipe. That's the messenger RNA. And once it gets inside your cells, it starts baking. It starts cooking. It starts its production of the spike protein. So a couple of things here that have now become clear, and I want people to understand this. Everyone's immunized in the arm, here in the shoulder, in the muscle, and the lipid nanoparticle with the messenger RNA goes into the cells that are in the muscle, in the arm. So that's your muscle cells. And that's cells of the immune system called antigen presenting cells that are in the area. And what happens is you now start, so the lipid, the fat bubble, actually is what allows fusion with your own cell membranes, because your own cell membranes are made up of similar composition, not exactly, but similar, enough to fuse it to allow the messenger RNA to go inside the cell. And once it's in there, it starts to be red, it's be baked, let's say, and produce the spike. Now, here's the thing that we now are clear about. Not everybody makes the same amount of spike, Wayne. Your cellular metabolism may be different than mine, definitely different than a child's, definitely different than an elderly person. So it means there's going to be different doses, different amounts of spike. This is a new feature. Normally what we do is we give the protein. We say you're going to get so much of the protein and every individual is going to get the same amount. Here, this means dose is different. Now, people argue, oh, it doesn't matter much about dose. It does, actually, because you can have high dose and low dose, and this can sometimes cause tolerance, or, you know, you become tolerant rather than making an active immune response. So, you know, their dose does matter. I've had people say, don't worry too much about that. No, I think we need to learn more about the dose, particularly in children and in the elderly. You know, in the elderly, something happens. It's called immunosenescence. That means the immune system kind of starts to wind down. It starts to become weaker. And so, and the metabolism of elderly people we know is quite different. And so, how much of the spike are they making? How much spike does a child make? We actually have no idea. So again, it's a variable that we're going to learn about, but right now we don't have the answer to that question. Here's the other thing that we're finding out as we go along, because the literature kind of comes to us and we look at it and we decide about it and we discuss it. But lipid nanoparticles, as it turns out, what you would want the vaccine to do goes into the muscle in your arm. You can see this arm better, goes in your arm, and the cells begin to produce the spike. Cells of the immune system are going to recognize it, and they're going to take it to what's called the draining lymph node, which is nearby lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are immunological factories. This is where cells of the immune system gather together to have a conversation about what they're seeing. In this case, it's the spike and what they're going to do. They're going to make immune response to that. And you like to keep that reaction local. And with most vaccines, that's the expectation. But what we have now seen, and with Pfizer's own report for sure, and we know this by studying and going back and looking at the history of nanoparticles, but we can see actually from some of Pfizer's own reports that within 15 minutes, nanoparticles are in every part of the body.
Wow.
Yeah. And that includes the vast majority is in the arm and in the draining lymph node, but there's a lot that very, very quickly is going to the liver. That makes sense for clearance, but it also means that cells of the liver now have the potential to start making spike protein. It goes to the spleen. It goes to the ovaries. This is a concern. In the bloodstream. And these tests were done every 15 minutes for 48 hours. You can see where the nanoparticles go. They also can go to the brain. We know that now. You actually don't want to allow proteins to cross what's known the blood-brain barrier. It's tight junctions that protects the brain. There are certain sites in the body that are called immunologically privileged sites. So you don't want inflammation. You don't want a whole lot of immune response going there. So it's carefully controlled. So, you know, you really don't want things crossing that blood-brain barrier. But nanoparticles, one of the reasons and how they were designed initially was to carry drugs to treat neurological disorders into the brain. So when you look at that literature historically, And then you see, oh, well, these lipid nanoparticles that are in part of the Pfizer vaccine, and I say the Pfizer because it's probably true with any that use lipid nanoparticles, but I've actually seen the Pfizer report, so I can talk about that authoritatively, goes to the brain. That's a concern. And so again, I think people just need to be aware. And that's different than other vaccines. And we're still learning about the ramifications of this. And maybe it's not a big problem, but in some people that maybe have high metabolism and then start to produce a lot of spike, for example, in the ovary, you wouldn't want to have a immunological attack of your ovary, or you wouldn't want to have inflammation in the brain. We also know that with some of these vaccines, we are seeing neurological disorders. We don't know the mechanism of that yet, but maybe it has to do with some of the things that I'm telling you about here with those vaccines. And I don't say that to scare anyone. I just say to put it in your information, things that you're looking at before you make your decision about this.
My takeaway out of what you're sharing with me here is that I'm feeling like our political establishment has really done you folks an incredibly massive disservice, and I'm not speaking in a personal sense. Obviously, that's a personal impact on you guys, but in their haste to look like they're doing something more than nothing, they have gone into your guys's cupboards and taken something and decided this is going to be the answer, and you guys are basically being put out there to hang out to dry, even though you guys are saying, "Me, you guys might be rushing this a little bit. We're not done with this yet. Yeah. We don't know where the problems can come from, and so you guys are really left with nothing that you can do except for talk about some of the micro segments of this discussion, because other than that, it takes you into the political realm again, because you guys are saying we believe in this stuff, but you're not doing this right, and you need to be doing this right, and people are going to get hurt, and we can't explain why. We can't understand why. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, yeah, and I mean, we're starting to learn why. And I guess as long as people understand, Canadians understand, or whoever is going to take the vaccine, they understand all of this, and they put it into the equation that they use to make their own decisions, that's fine, because they are providing a great deal of information, but that might not be their intention. So, that is part of the parcel. I just like to provide the information. I believe Canadians are smart. They can make their own wise choices if they're given the information. And that's part of why we just wanted to have a conversation about this, even with the Premier, with the task force, in hopes of giving them some other pathways forward, some other ways of thinking about this. And maybe yet we'll be given that opportunity. But I'll talk a little bit about the AstraZeneca, because it's a different one and it's an important one. And I think there's some things to talk about there before we have to wrap up. So the AstraZeneca is the DNA vaccine, and it is not carried in the lipid bubble that we talked about. It's carried in an adenovirus vector. So it's another virus. And in the case of AstraZeneca, it's a chimpanzee virus. And what they did is they took the adenovirus from the chimpanzees and they degutted it. They take most of the engine out and they put the recipe for spike of SARS-CoV-2 into there. And so that's a different kind of delivery system. Now, again, when I'm talking to Canadians, I often just ask them, did you know it's a chimpanzee viral vector? That's not the same, if you're talking about the Johnson & Johnson, that's not. It's adenovirus, but it's a human adenovirus. And I just want to ask them, did Do you know that it's a chimpanzee if you got the AstraZeneca? And 9 times out of 10, no, they don't. And I guess the reason I'm kind of primed to ask that question is, I've done a lot of work in food producing livestock, and I'm very conscious of the fact that Canadians don't want to eat GMO foods. I mean, they don't want anything that's genetically modified in any way. And so I'm curious as to whether, they're comfortable having the AstraZeneca, which has the chimpanzee vector. Again, if they are, no problem, but I think they deserve to know, just like we try and inform Canadians if they're eating GMO salmon or whatever it is, so that they can make their choice. It's all about choice. Now, a lot of talk is about the AstraZeneca, and we have had some problems with that. Everyone knows that. I don't think that's any secret. And we had asked the government many, many months ago, we made the recommendation that Canada suspend use. This was when other countries around the world were one after another suspending use. And so we were looking at that, and we could see, yes, there's problems with what we were calling, which come to be called VIT, vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia. And we knew that was associated with this. But again, we were basically told we were overreacting. But recently we see Canada needed to suspend it. And so now we're in a predicament. And we've gotten a lot of questions about, well, I took AstraZeneca. Can't remember the exact number, but like 2 million Canadians or something have been given AstraZeneca. And, so now we're getting a lot of questions. Well, what do I do now? And I think Canadians just need to have a debate on that too. They need to hear a conversation. Right now, people are just saying, go and get your next AstraZeneca. It's fine. Wait a minute. Let's talk about this first of all. If you didn't have a great reaction the first time, you know that now. You personally know what kind of reaction. We know that the reaction to the booster is most times, not always, but most times, there's more reaction to the booster. So take that into account. Take into account the risk of VIT. Now, here, there was a study out of the UK, just one that I'm aware of, where they combined vaccines. So, okay, you got AstraZeneca on the prime, you get AstraZeneca on the boost. You got AstraZeneca on the prime, you get Pfizer on the boost. You got AstraZeneca on the prime, you get Moderna on the boost, and so on. And there was only 830 individuals in that study. And those were divided into, I believe, 4 groups. So each group only had a couple of hundred people. That's not a lot of people. But what they did find is that when you combine the vaccine, AstraZeneca, with Pfizer or Moderna, those individuals had increased fever, increased headache, and increased fatigue. So that leads people to think, well, if you mix the vaccines, you're going to have a little more reaction. So think about how much reaction you had the first time. Are you prepared to have a little more reaction the next time? Even if you go AstraZeneca, but if you mix them, you're going to. But here's the thing, here's the other point I really want Canadians to understand. The VIT reactions were seen, well, first they said in Canada there were like 1 in 250,000, and then 1 in 100,000. Then they said 1 in 60,000, and now the last I heard it's 1 in 50,000. So let's just say the 1 in 50,000. So if you want to run a trial that's going to show up these serious reactions, 830 isn't going to do it, right? If you want to see one, you better have at least 50,000 in the study. So you see why you have to have large studies? So they said, they concluded or alluded and to the fact that, well, okay, we saw more of the headache, fatigue, those kind of reactions, but we didn't see any VIT. So it's safe, go ahead, boost. Well, for me, I go, well, hold the fort. You didn't have the power. This was an underpowered study. You probably weren't going to see any VIT with just 830 people. I just want Canadians to be aware of that, because now they're right at the point where they have to make a decision. Are they going to just stop and say, that's enough? I did my AstraZeneca. I did my first shot. Maybe I'm going to quit there. Are they going to go back and have AstraZeneca again because Canada's allowing it? Or are they going to mix and go with the Pfizer or the Moderna? Again, those are the facts. People just need to put that into their decision making. And yeah.
There's one word that you brought up in there that I'd like to kind of spin a few things around, and it was the word overreacting. And so a few weeks ago, Dr. Tam came out and said, "Oh, it's okay to mix and match. Just like socks. You mix and match these things." And people are going, "Wait a minute. We're seeing all these differing reports. Most of us have seen the ex-Pfizer guy coming out and saying some not very good things about the company that he used to work for and their products, and yet." We're being told we're overreacting. When your guys are being told that you're overreacting, being the experts in these fields, where does that come from? Who that tells you guys that you guys are overreacting?
Probably a lot of people. I mean, I guess, but listen, I want to say this. I think it comes from fear. Canadians, I mean, the people have really been afraid. And the fear continues. And honestly, I don't think you can make good choices out of fear.
No.
You've got to look at the facts. And so I think people just are fearful when we say, maybe you just want to hold and think, because they don't know another way out. And there are other ways out. One, if you've recovered already, you're good. If you're under 20, you're in excellent shape. So why on earth, would you're going to have to think carefully why we vaccinate children when they're really not at risk. And, then the report comes out, you see some news, one study that shows these inflammatory reactions in kids, but, after they get COVID. But first you have to have a child that gets COVID, serious COVID. And I mean, those are rare. So again, I think we got the risk assessments a little wrong. And again, if we could see if they already had immunity, this would clear up a lot of things. So if we could test for antibody, it might not be perfect, but it's a good indication. If we can test for T cells, now we can say...
It only makes sense. If we have herd immunity, why are we pushing vaccines?
Yeah,
unproven vaccines.
Exactly. At least we could decide very carefully who we know it's the frail and the elderly that we're trying to protect. We maybe would say that's where we're going to vaccinate. Now, here's the other thing. We know something about sort of the immediate reactions. These are anaphylactic reactions to the vaccine. We're learning more about what happens in the first 30 days. That's where you have the VIT, the bleeding disorders, and the neurological disorders. We're learning about that, but we have no clue about long-term. We can't possibly, because we've only been vaccinating for, several months. We don't know. But I can tell you again that there are papers in the literature that do show something that's called molecular mimicry. And that's when what pieces of the virus look similar or mimic parts of proteins that are our own, human, right? And there was a paper published and it showed there was something like 26 proteins that could possibly cross-react. And so that is an indication that you might want to keep your eye on autoimmunity in the future. And this isn't unheard of, but we don't know. So I say that because if you're vaccinating an elderly person who's at high risk, I mean, their window for autoimmunity is small, right? Because if they're already in their 60, 70, 80s, they are nearing the end of their lifespan. But if you're vaccinating children with a long lifespan ahead of them, you want to know about the long-term effects before you vaccinate, particularly when they're at low risk, very low risk, and particularly when you could find out what the status of their immune system is. So I guess that's something that parents I want them to think about. That's all. Just to have that as part of the equation, the risk benefit analysis, and just know we don't know about the long-term effects of these things. Yeah, so a lot going into decision making. Oh, and maybe, I know we're probably coming to the end here. Just one more thing, and it's that I want to mention, and that is about treatment. So we've talked a lot. We've talked about immunity. We've talked about the vaccines. We've talked about the risk groups. And now the one thing that I've come to understand is that there are treatments as well. And these treatments, you're going to talk to Peter. Peter McCullough is coming up next, and this is his wheelhouse. This is his area. And I mean, we've looked at the literature together. He's on our calls. So is Pierre Corey. And we now see that Pierre Corey, Peter McCullough, and others have published on repurposed drugs, they're called. Things like ivermectin. And I know a lot of people are talking about ivermectin, but we can't officially really be using it in Canada. But I think now there's enough information out there to show that drugs like ivermectin, hydrochloroquine, fluoxamine can be used. And I think this to quite effectively treat. I mean, I'll let Peter talk about that. I'll let people look at the literature on that, because you can definitely find it. But the consensus, I went to a webinar last weekend, an international conference on ivermectin, some of the world experts there. People can get a link to that too.
I'll add a link to that as well. Thank you for sharing that with me last night. It was a couple hours. I got about halfway through it last night. I found it very interesting.
But I think, wouldn't that play into it? So if Canadians understood they need to see, if they've recovered, they're most likely immune. They should have their antibody and T cells, assessed. There is some effective treatments that I think should be highly considered, and people can ask their doctors about this. That should go into the decision making about getting vaccinated, who to get vaccinated, your children, yourself, your grandmother. And the decision may be different depending on your age, your comorbidity, your immune status, and if you realize that maybe there are some treatments available that we haven't been talking about. So that provides exit strategy as well.
Well,
right?
That was one of the things that we had intended to touch on a little bit, but that's okay, because now I'll have an excuse to bring you back even sooner for another discussion. But you said a lot of poignant things in that last statement there, and a lot of it comes down to informed consent, and the actual information is really lagging behind in versus the process, and the process, I feel, is being driven by fear. And that's I think so much of what's going on, and it's created the reaction is fear driven, and they seem committed to that fear driven reaction, and the fact that we are not gaining being openly having these discussions and hearing from experts like you that are able to address some of those fears, not dispel them, but address them and provide answers. This is a big thing that, I mean, Canadians can handle bad news, but what they can't handle is being lied to and omitted from the conversation. That's something that we don't tolerate very well, and so this is kind of all backfiring with the pressure that the governments are exerting, and the pressure is coming before the information. That's not acceptable to people, I don't think. And by eliminating the discussion for treatments, for options, those discussions until having these interviews with you guys, I don't think any Canadians were aware of so many different options and things to consider and information to consider, because we're being so motivated by the discussions that are motivated by the fear. So very, very grateful for your time and all of this. And to be quite honest with you, if somebody would have told me 6 months ago that I would be having such wonderful discussions with such pro-vaccination professionals, I probably would have said, no, that's not really the interview for me. But I'm very grateful for you guys to do this. And it's a brave thing to enter into this field of discussion in something, in an arena where everybody is probably terrified of you. So it's unfair to you.
I don't know about that, but we appreciate you having us on, because really all we're wanting to do is provide Canadians with information. We believe they can make wise choices if they're given appropriate information. And I always like to say, these are my professional opinions. They don't necessarily reflect those of the University of Guelph. But I really am happy to just provide information to whoever's watching this.
And honestly, that is exactly how trust is built. Not somebody saying our experts anonymously and then feeding stuff to the people, treating them like children. We're grown adults, and we want these discussions. So I appreciate you guys for pushing that initiative to try and force these discussions through any means necessary, peacefully, of course. But there's going to be a lot more of this, and I really hope that you'll join us again soon. Your final message to the community that's out there.
It's really stay informed and get your information from a wide range of sources, and think critically about the decisions that you're going to make around your own health. It is your choice. It is your body. It is your choice. I don't think coercion should be the thing. I think it should be what you feel comfortable with. And we shouldn't be, trying to force each other or, make each other feel bad. We should just say, here's the information, because different people are going to make different choices, and that's okay.
I thank you so very much for that. And on behalf of us all, keep up the good fight, and I cannot wait to have you back again. Perhaps you'll join us with some of the small panel discussions that we're going to be bringing forth to everybody. So again, thank you for your time very much today, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. If you want to hang out in the back end of the show there for a second, I'll close this off, and we'll carry on.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye for now. All right, guys, another jam-packed hour. I know some of these questions are not necessarily the answers you're looking for, but the truth rarely is. We need to look at all of the information, and we're really trying really hard to bring you not the information that you necessarily want to hear, but what you need to hear. And please take all of these interviews with a grain of salt. These are in progression, and this is evolving all of the time, and we're going to keep following up with this. We're going to be putting together some panel discussions, like I said, where we can address certain topics specifically. So I appreciate you guys joining us here today, and if we didn't get to your questions in the chat, or if we didn't get those answered, don't be discouraged. We will get to them. There's a lot of questions and a lot of information to cipher through, so we'll just keep doing what we're doing. Share these videos out. There's more coming. Again, so I guess it's 4 o'clock Alberta time, Mountain Time. We've got Dr. McCullough on, and we'll be talking to a lot of really great things. If you guys don't know Dr. McCullough, you probably recognize him from the interview he gave with Tucker Carlson a couple of weeks ago. So lots more coming, folks. Thank you so much for your time and hanging out with us and sharing these out, and we will chat with you all in a couple of hours. Bye for now. Stay Canadian. Let's make Canada Canada again.